The definition of an out-of-bounds player has been expanded this year. In the past, an out-of-bounds player was defined as a player who had any part of him touching anything other than a player or a game official that was on or outside the sideline or end line. This required some type of physical touching with something out of bounds to be considered an out-of-bounds player. An inbounds player, on the other hand, was not really defined. Basically, a player was inbounds if he was not out of bounds. What that meant was a player was inbounds if he was not touching something out of bounds. So what did that mean for a player who left the ground and went airborne? Well, under the prior rule, if the airborne player was not touching something out of bounds, he was considered inbounds. The new rule changes this by amending the definition of who is out of bounds. So under the new rule, to be out of bounds, the player still has the first requirement. He's out of bounds if any part of him is touching anything other than a player or game official that is on or outside the sideline or end line. The new part of the rule is that he maintains that status if he goes airborne. So he keeps the status of where he left the ground until he returns the ground. So what does that mean for our airborne player? Is he inbounds or out of bounds? It depends on where he left the ground from, because he maintains the status of the ground when he leaves it. So if he leaves the ground from out of bounds, he continues to be an out of bounds player while airborne. On the other hand, if he leaves the ground from inbounds, he continues to be an inbounds player while airborne. So what does this mean for the game? Well, let's talk about if that airborne player touches a loose ball. If the player left the ground from out of bounds and touches the loose ball, the ball is dead when it's touched. And that's true even if the player was forced out of bounds. If the player left the ground from inbounds and touches the loose ball, the ball remains alive. If the player leaves the ground from out of bounds, but reestablishes in the field of play and becomes an inbounds player and touches the ball remains alive because the ball has done nothing other than touch an inbounds player. So is touching the ball while out of bounds a foul? It depends. If the player intentionally goes out of bounds and touches the ball, that is a foul for illegal participation. But this is a very rare circumstance, and officials do not need to go looking for it. If a player accidentally goes out of bounds and goes airborne and touches the ball, there is no foul. The ball simply becomes dead, and if it's a forward pass, it becomes an incomplete pass. This is the normal situation that we're most likely to see during the game. When a receiver is running down the sideline or in the end zone close to the end line and accidentally touches that line, jumps up and touches the pass. That's not a foul. It just makes the ball become dead and results in an incomplete pass. Of course, remember that an A or a K player can't go out of bounds on their own and return in bounds and participate, but that's a different question from whether the ball becomes dead. So how does this affect our mechanics? Well, our perimeter officials, the head linesman, the line judge, the field judge, side judge, and back judge, have already had to be aware of whether a player steps out of bounds. And our mechanics call for that official to throw their hat on the ground when they see a receiver step out of bounds. Now we also have to be aware of when the player leaves the ground, if he's leaving from inbounds or out of bounds, and if he's leaving the ground from out of bounds, if he reestablishes inbounds before touching the ball.